10 years ago, I left my hometown with one suitcase, a broken engagement, and no real idea what I was going to do next. I was 28, and I remember thinking that if I could just get far enough away, maybe I could stop feeling like the daughter nobody had really chosen. I had just found out that my fiancé had been seeing my younger sister. I wish I could say I handled it well. I didn't. I sat at my parents' kitchen table with printed copies of their messages because, for some reason, I thought my mother would finally understand. I thought she'd be angry for me. Maybe she'd hug me. Maybe she'd look at my sister and say, just once, that what happened wasn't my fault. Instead, she looked at those pages and told me my sister deserved a chance at happiness too. I still remember that sentence. 3 days later, I left. For the next 10 years, I built a life nobody in my family knew anything about. I started on a loading dock in Dayton, worked my way into logistics, and eventually bought into the company I worked for. Years later, I owned it outright. I never called my mother to tell her. I never told my sister. I didn't even tell my father. Then, 3 weeks ago, a man walked into my office asking me to save his business. He talked about his 41 employees, the building he'd mortgaged, and how badly he needed our company to renew his contract. And then he looked at the photograph sitting on my desk. That's when he finally recognized me. It was Daniel. The man who had been my fiancé, and now he was sitting across from me asking me for help, without knowing that I had been carrying a secret about his marriage for almost a decade. The worst part wasn't that I still had the secret. It was that, for the first time, I had the power to decide what happened to him. My name is Eleanor Doyle, though almost everyone who's ever known me calls me Nora, and I am 56 years old. 3 weeks ago, I got a phone call from a man named Russell Hatch, my mother's estate attorney, telling me that my mother, Vivian Doyle, had died in her sleep at 81, and that her entire estate, the house, the savings, and what was left of Doyle Hardware and Feed, had gone to my younger brother Daniel. All of it, except for one item. A cedar box, roughly the size of a toaster, with a brass clasp and a lock my mother had specifically instructed, in writing, could only be opened by me. Not read to me, not described to me. Opened by me, in person, with my key, or burned unopened if I never came for it. I hadn't set foot in Belhaven in 20 years. I hadn't spoken to my mother in 20 years. I had built an entire second life in that time, a marriage, a daughter now grown, a business with my name on the door, and none of it had ever once required my mother's blessing to exist. And now my brother, who inherited a house, a business, and roughly $400,000 in combined assets, was calling Russell Hatch 3 times a week trying to get that one box, worth nothing at auction, destroyed before I ever laid eyes on it. That tells you something about what was inside it. It took me a while to understand what, exactly, but I'll get there. If you're the kind of person who's been written out of a family story while you were still standing right in front of them, stay with me, because I think you already know how this starts. And if this is the first time you're watching one of these, all I'll ask is that if the story earns it by the end, you hit like and subscribe, and maybe tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every one. Now let me take you back to where this actually began, which wasn't 20 years ago. It was earlier than that. Belhaven, if you've never heard of it, is a town of about 4,100 people in the kind of county where the biggest building isn't a church, it's a feed store. Ours. Doyle Hardware and Feed had been on Main Street since my grandfather built it in 1961, and by the time I was born, it was already the thing that told you who our family was in that town. My father, Walter, worked the counter for 34 years, same register, same brand of unfiltered cigarettes he never quite quit, same navy work apron with DOY stitched over the pocket in thread that had gone gray by the time I was in high school. My mother did the books, or said she did. What she actually did was decide who in that family got to be right. My father, I should say clearly, was never cruel to me, not once, not directly. Walter Doyle's failure was quieter than that, the failure of a man who had decided somewhere early in his marriage that keeping the peace with my mother was worth more than keeping things fair between his children, and who spent the next 3 decades proving that math correct in 100 small ways he probably never once added up the way I eventually would. He'd slip me an extra $5 on the sly when Danny got new cleats and I didn't, a gesture that felt, even at 10, less like justice and more like hush money for a debt he didn't have the nerve to pay openly. I was born 4 years before my brother Daniel, who everyone called Danny, and from about the time he could walk, the math in that house was simple. Danny got the bigger room, the one that didn't share a wall with the furnace. Danny's Little League trophies went on the mantle, mine went in a box in the closet, even the year I made all-county in track and he didn't make the team at all. When I was 11, my mother took me to a track meet 40 minutes away and sat in the car the whole time because, she said, she had a headache. She drove the same 40 minutes the next month to watch Danny sit on a bench for 2 hours of a baseball game he didn't play in. I want to be careful here because it would be easy to make this sound like a simple story about a favorite child and a forgotten one, and it wasn't quite that clean. My mother loved Danny the way some people love a project they've invested too much in to walk away from. And she used me, from a very young age, as the place where the family's actual problems got quietly filed away. If Danny broke something, I was the one who was supposed to have been watching him. If Danny failed a class, it was because I hadn't helped him study, even though I was 11 and he was 7. I started keeping a small green account book when I was about 13, not because anyone asked me to, but because I had figured out that if I wrote down what actually happened, on what day, in what order, I could at least know the truth even when nobody around me was interested in it. I didn't know it then, but that was the beginning of the only skill that would ever really belong to me. There's a specific memory I keep coming back to, from the summer I was 12. Doyle Hardware and Feed sponsored a Little League team every year, and the sponsor's family always got a photo on the wall behind the register. That year, Danny, who was 8 and hadn't played a single inning all season because of a wrist he'd sprained on the first day of practice, stood front and center in that photo in full uniform, smiling. I was the one who'd actually kept the scorebook for that team all season, at my mother's insistence, unpaid, because she said it would look responsible on a college application eventually. I'm not in that photo at all. It hung on that wall for 11 years. I know because I checked. Every single time we went back for something, right up until the year I stopped going back at all. The one person in that house, and really in that whole family, who saw me clearly was my mother's younger sister, my Aunt Dot. Dorothy Kessler had left Belhaven at 19 and never fully come back, which in my mother's eyes made her the family's cautionary tale, the sister who'd chosen a nursing career in the city over a husband and a house on Larkspur Road. To me, she was the only adult who called on my birthday and asked me actual questions and waited for actual answers, who noticed when I went quiet at Thanksgiving and pulled me into the kitchen to dry dishes with her, not because she needed help, but because it gave us a reason to stand next to each other without anyone watching. She taught me to make a pot roast the one week she stayed with us when I was 15, standing behind me at the stove correcting my grip on the knife with 2 fingers and no words at all. She was the one who, when I got into the state university on a partial scholarship at 18, sent me a card with $40 in it and the words "You did that yourself, remember that," written in her cramped, slanted hand. I still have that card. It is, by a wide margin, the oldest thing in my house, and some years it has been the only proof I had that I hadn't imagined the whole thing, that there had once been at least one person in that family who looked at me and saw something worth keeping. I want to fast forward through college and my first marriage, which lasted 4 years and ended amicably enough that I won't spend your time on it, and land on the year I turned 30, when I moved back to Belhaven to help run the books at Doyle Hardware and Feed, because my father's eyes were going and my mother, whatever else she was, wasn't a bookkeeper. By then, Danny was 26, engaged to a woman named Sherilyn Pruitt, whose family owned 3 car dealerships across 2 counties and were, by Belhaven standards, close to royalty. My mother had decided that this engagement was going to be the thing that finally proved the Doyles belonged at the same table as the Pruitts, and she wanted nothing, absolutely nothing, standing in the way of that wedding. Which brings me to the year everything actually broke, the year I was 36. That March, doing the quarterly reconciliation, I found 2 loans against the business, one for $18,400 and one for $28,450, both taken out against inventory collateral, both carrying my father's signature, except my father hadn't signed either one. I'd watched that man sign his name for 30 years. He wrote a W that looked like a bird taking off. Whoever signed these had gotten close, but not close enough not to somebody who'd been keeping his books for 6 years. $46,850, gone and traced, once I pulled the disbursement records, straight into an account that Danny had opened at a bank 2 towns over, the same month he'd quietly paid off a gambling debt to a man nobody in the family was supposed to know he owed money to. I brought it to my mother first, privately, the way you'd bring anything to a person you still, foolishly, hoped would want the truth. I laid the ledger on her kitchen table, the same table Danny's engagement photos were sitting on in a frame, and I told her what I'd found. She looked at the numbers for a long time. Then she looked at me, and she said the sentence that I would spend the next 20 years hearing in my head at the worst possible moments. A mother protects her son. That's what mothers do. She wanted me to go to the bank, tell them the discrepancy was mine, a bookkeeping error, and quietly pay it back myself over time so that Danny's name and by extension his engagement to a Pruitt would stay clean. I said no. I told her I wasn't going to lie to a bank, or to Sherilyn's family, or to anyone, to cover for something I hadn't done. 4 days later, at a family dinner I had been told was for planning the engagement party, my mother stood at the head of that table and told everyone gathered, my father, Danny, Sherilyn, Aunt Dot, 3 cousins, that I had been stealing from the family business for years and had finally been caught, and that she would not have a thief under her roof or at her son's wedding. She said I was no longer her daughter. She said it exactly like that, in front of 11 people, most of whom had known me my entire life. Nobody at that table said a word in my defense. Not my father, who kept his eyes on the gravy boat like it required his full attention. Not Danny, who sat there with his eyes on his plate the whole time, the whole 4 minutes. I counted. It felt like an hour. Sherilyn reached over at one point and squeezed his hand, and he let her, and that was the closest thing to a reaction he offered. I remember asking my mother, once, quietly, while the rest of the table sat frozen, whether she actually believed what she was saying, or whether she just needed somebody in that room to believe it. She didn't answer the question. She told me to go get my things before Walter had to watch her call the sheriff on her own daughter. I was banned from the house that night and told not to come back for Christmas, or for anything else, ever, and Aunt Dot was the only person at that table who stood up and walked out to the driveway with me, saying nothing the entire way, just standing there with her arms crossed against the cold until I'd finished loading the one duffel bag I'd been allowed back inside to pack. I left Belhaven 6 weeks later with what fit in my car and never told most of them where I went. I kept the green account book. Everything else, the yearbooks, the track medals, a box of photographs from a childhood that apparently didn't count anymore, I left behind, and as far as I know, it's all still sitting in a crawl space above the garage on Larkspur Road, or it went to the dump years ago, and either way, nobody ever asked me if I wanted it back. Before I go any further, I want to pause for 1 second, because I know some of you have a version of this story of your own, maybe not with a hardware store or a locked box, but with a moment where a family decided the truth was less important than the story they wanted to tell about themselves. If that's you, I'd genuinely like to hear it in the comments. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe, because this is going to take a while, and I'd like you here for the part where it turns. Now, to understand what came next, you have to understand what I did with the 6 years after that dinner, because none of what happened later makes sense without it. I moved to a city 3 hours from Belhaven, waited tables for 8 months while I figured out what I actually wanted, and enrolled in night classes for accounting, the thing I'd already been doing for free for 6 years without a title or a license to show for it. I finished my associate's degree in 2 years, transferred and finished a bachelor's in 3 more while working full-time, and sat for the CPA exam the year I turned 42, passing all 4 sections on the first try, which the woman proctoring the exam told me almost nobody does. I framed the license and hung it in an apartment that had, for the first 18 months I lived in it, no other artwork on the walls at all. Aunt Dot called me every single Sunday for those first 6 years, at 7 in the evening, without fail. She was, in those early years especially, the one fixed point in a life that otherwise felt like it was being rebuilt from nothing. Year 1 after I left, I still had my father's number memorized and called it twice. Both times my mother answered and hung up without a word, the second time so fast I wasn't sure she'd even recognized my voice before she did it. I was living in a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat that year, and most nights the only sound in the building was the dryers running until midnight, which I found oddly comforting, because it meant somebody else in the world was also awake and dealing with their own mess at 2 in the morning. Year 2, Aunt Dot drove up unannounced on a Saturday with a box of my grandmother's old canning jars in the trunk of her car, because, she said, somebody in this family ought to actually use them, and she wasn't about to let them rot in Vivian's basement doing nothing. We spent that whole afternoon putting up peaches in my tiny kitchen, and it was the first time in almost a year I'd laughed hard enough that it startled me. Year 3, I heard through a cousin, secondhand and unconfirmed, that Danny and Sherilyn's wedding had been written up in the county paper, 4 full paragraphs, and I wasn't mentioned as a sibling anywhere in it, not even as absent, not even as a name that had been quietly removed. That same year, on the other side of the ledger, Dot showed up at my apartment on my birthday with a store-bought cake because she said she didn't trust her own oven that week, and we ate half of it standing at the counter because neither of us wanted to bother finding plates. Year 4, my daughter Josephine was born 4 years after I left Belhaven, and Dot drove 11 hours by herself to sit in a hospital waiting room, and she brought a blanket she'd crocheted in a yellow and gray pattern because, she said, you never know which one they're going to want and you don't want to guess wrong. That blanket is still on the back of Josephine's bed 21 years and one very worn edge later. Nobody from my mother's side of the family sent so much as a card, and I remember checking the mailbox for 2 straight weeks anyway, which tells you something about how long it actually takes a person to stop expecting a family to act like one. Year 5, I passed my CPA exam, and the only person outside my own household who knew was Aunt Dot, who mailed me a card that said "proud is too small a word" in ink that had started to fade by the time I got it, because she'd apparently written it weeks before the results even came out, certain of what they'd say. I started my own firm at 44, Doyle Forensic Accounting, and yes, I kept the name on purpose. I'd been told I wasn't allowed to be a Doyle anymore, and there was a particular kind of quiet satisfaction in putting that name on a shingle and building something with it that nobody in that family could take credit for or take away. Year 6, I ran into a woman named Carla Jenner in a grocery store 3 towns away, someone I'd gone to high school with, and she told me, with the particular relish some people reserve for delivering news they suspect will sting, that she'd heard I'd left Bellhaven under a cloud, her words, and asked, not unkindly, but not carefully either, what had really happened. I gave her the same small, true version I would later give Josephine. She looked unconvinced, the way people do when the story they'd already been told is more interesting than the one you're offering instead. And I remember standing in that cereal aisle thinking that my mother's version of events had a 20-town head start on mine, and there was nothing I could do about it except keep living a life that eventually made the math obvious to anyone patient enough to look. Year 7, my father had a mild stroke, and I only found out because Dot heard it from a neighbor and called to tell me, not to ask me to come, just so I wouldn't hear it secondhand from a stranger. He recovered most of his speech within a few months. I sent flowers to the hospital with no card attached because I genuinely couldn't decide what I would have written, and some part of me was still hoping he'd guess who they were from. I never found out if he did. Year 8, on the other side of the ledger again, Dot showed up unannounced the week I found a lump during a routine exam that turned out, 3 anxious weeks later, to be nothing at all. She hadn't come to talk about it, she said, just to sit with me while I didn't feel like talking, and she stayed 4 days cooking the same 3 meals on rotation and asking nothing of me except that I eat them. Year 9, I finally, after 2 years of putting it off, drove past the old track where I'd run in middle school, just to see it, on a work trip that happened to route me within 20 minutes of Bellhaven. I didn't get out of the car. I sat in the parking lot for maybe 6 minutes with the engine running, looking at a chain-link fence that had rusted through in the same spot it always had, and then I turned around and drove the rest of the way to my meeting. I mention that because I think people assume a clean break feels clean the whole way through, and it doesn't. It just gets quieter. If any of this sounds familiar to you, the long stretch of years where nothing dramatic happens but the distance just keeps compounding, I want you to know that's a completely normal shape for this kind of grief to take. It isn't one loud event. It's 1,000 small confirmations, spread out over a decade, that the door really is staying shut. If you're in the middle of one of those stretches right now, I see you, and I'd genuinely like to hear where you are in it, in the comments below. Year 11, Josephine asked me, the way 7-year-olds ask things, flat and curious and without any sense of how much weight the question carried, why she didn't have a grandma like the other kids in her class. I told her the truth, in the smallest version I could manage. I said that Grandma and I disagreed about something very important a long time ago, and that Grandma decided that meant we couldn't be family anymore. Josephine thought about that for a second and said, that seems like a strange rule for someone to make, out of the mouths of 7-year-olds. Year 12, my firm took on its first case with a genuine 6-figure recovery, a small manufacturing outfit that had been quietly bled for years by a plant manager who'd been with the company since it started, and the owner cried in my office when I handed him the final report, not because of the number, he told me, but because his own brother had been the one to suggest hiring us in the first place, and he hadn't wanted to believe either of them, the manager or his own brother's suspicion, until the numbers made it impossible not to. I thought about that a great deal that year, the particular loneliness of being the person whose job is to make a family finally look at what it doesn't want to see. Year 13, Dot's own health scared us for a few months, a heart procedure that went fine in the end but that had me driving the 11 hours to sit with her the same way she'd once driven to sit with me, and I remember thinking, in that hospital hallway, that this, whatever this was, the two of us taking turns showing up for each other across a decade and a half, was the actual definition of the word family, whatever my mother had once decided it meant instead. By year 14, my firm had grown to 9 employees and a reputation, at least in our part of the state, for the kind of forensic work that insurance companies and small business owners call in when the regular numbers stop adding up and somebody suspects it isn't an accident. I want to be honest with you, there is a version of me that built that entire career, that entire specialty, because some part of me never stopped wanting to be the person in the room who could prove, with documents instead of feelings, exactly what happened and exactly who did it. I wasn't chasing my brother. I told myself that for years. But I was absolutely, unmistakably, building the exact set of skills that would have made that dinner table conversation 20 years earlier impossible to win against me. Year 15, Tom and I got married, a small courthouse ceremony with 11 guests, and Aunt Dot walked me down a hallway that was not, in any sense, an aisle, wearing a corsage she'd bought herself because nobody had thought to arrange one, and she cried harder at that ceremony than I did. My father's chair at the small reception dinner afterward sat empty. I hadn't invited him, if I'm being honest, not out of spite by that point, but because I genuinely didn't know anymore what it would mean if he'd said yes. Year 16, my firm handled a case involving a family-run trucking company where one adult son had been quietly rerouting fuel reimbursements into a separate account for almost 6 years, and I remember sitting across from that family's stunned father in our conference room, watching him try to reconcile the son he thought he knew with the ledger sitting in front of him, and thinking, not for the first time, that I had built an entire career out of sitting in the seat my own mother had refused to sit in 20 years earlier. Year 16 and a half, if I can call it that, Sherilyn's mother passed away, and I only knew because the funeral notice ran in the same regional paper my old track meets used to get listed in, a paper I still, out of some old habit I never quite broke, checked online every few months. I noticed, reading the notice, that the surviving family listed included Danny and Sherilyn and their 2 children, whose names I didn't recognize because I'd never once been told them. I sat with that for a while, the strange vertigo of having a niece and nephew who wouldn't know my face if they passed me on the street. Somewhere around year 17, my mother sent Josephine a birthday card, addressed correctly, to the correct house, which meant she'd known our address the whole time and simply chosen not to use it for 17 years. Inside was a $20 bill and no note. Josephine, who was 14 by then and had heard the whole story from me in the plain, age-appropriate pieces I'd doled out over the years, looked at that card for a long moment and then handed it back to me and said, "I don't want this." He was right not to. I kept the 20 in an envelope in my desk drawer anyway, not because I needed the money, but because it was the only physical object my mother had sent in 17 years, and some part of me, the part that still did the accounting on things that had nothing to do with money, wanted the receipt. It was around this same time, year 18 or so, that my firm took on the case that would end up, without my knowing it, changing everything. A family-owned agricultural cooperative 2 counties over hired us after their outside auditor flagged inconsistencies in the grain settlement accounts. It took my team 5 months to trace $2,300,000 that had been siphoned off over 9 years by the co-op's own general manager, who happened to be the founder's nephew. We testified. It went to trial. It made the regional business paper, with my name and my firm's name in the second paragraph, above the fold, in a story about family businesses and the particular kind of fraud that happens when nobody wants to believe someone they love could do something like that. That story ran in April, in a paper that, it turns out, still gets picked up and shared in a private Facebook group for Belhaven natives that I did not know existed and had certainly never joined. A group with something like 1,100 members, most of whom had left town decades ago and stayed connected the way small towns do now, through screenshots and shared links instead of the diner counter. A member of that group, whose sister-in-law happened to attend the same church as my brother, shared the article with the caption, "Isn't this the Doyle girl?" And within a day it had picked up 30-some comments, several of which apparently speculated, in the casual, half-informed way small towns love to speculate, about whatever had happened to make me leave in the first place. It made it back to Danny inside of 11 days. I know that timeline exactly, because of what happened next and because, as it turns out, I would eventually get to read some of the messages myself, secondhand, through the same network of people who had kept me half-informed about that family for 2 decades without my ever having to ask them to. I'll admit, when I first found out the article had circulated back to Belhaven, some small, petty part of me felt a flicker of satisfaction, the kind I'm not entirely proud of. 20 years of being told I wasn't worth mentioning, and here was my name, in print, above the fold, doing exactly the kind of work my mother had once demanded I quietly absorb the blame for instead. That feeling didn't last long. Mostly what I felt, once the dust settled, was tired. The particular exhaustion of realizing that even your own professional success had somehow become another data point in a family argument you'd never agreed to keep having. I need you to stay with me here, because this is where it stopped being a story about the past and became something that was actively happening. If you've made it this far, that tells me you're the kind of person who sits with a story instead of skimming it, and I appreciate that more than you know. There's more coming, and it gets tighter from here. My mother died on a Tuesday in June, in her sleep, at 81, and I found out the way I found out about most things in that family for the last 20 years, from Aunt Dot, who called me at 10,014 in the morning with her voice already shaking. I felt something complicated when she told me. Not grief exactly, or not only grief. Something closer to the feeling of a door you've spent 20 years bracing against finally, quietly, closing on its own. The estate attorney, Russell Hatch, reached out 4 days later. He read me the will over the phone in the flat, careful tone lawyers use when they know a call is going to be difficult. The house on Larkspur Road, the remaining shares in Doyle Hardware and Feed, and roughly $400,000 in combined savings and investment accounts, all to Daniel. There was exactly one exception, one paragraph which Russell read to me twice because I asked him to. A cedar box, my mother's, currently held in the firm's safe, to be released to Eleanor Doyle and no other person upon presentation of a specific brass key, which my mother had mailed to Russell's office under separate sealed cover 11 years earlier, with written instructions that if Eleanor did not come forward within 1 year of Vivian's death, the box was to be destroyed unopened, its contents never disclosed to anyone, including Daniel. 11 years. My mother had set this in motion 11 years before she died, and never once, in all that time, picked up a phone to tell me herself. Danny, Russell told me, almost apologetically, had already called the office 6 times in the 2 weeks since the will was read, each time asking some version of the same question. Whether the box could simply be considered lost. Whether, since I clearly wasn't part of the family anymore, the box could reasonably just pass to him along with everything else. Whether there was any legal path to open it himself first, just to see, before deciding whether I even needed to know it existed. I asked Russell, as calmly as I could manage, why a locked wooden box with presumably no monetary value at all was worth 6 phone calls from a man who just inherited $400,000. He said he couldn't speculate, that his job was simply to carry out the instructions as written, but I could speculate. I've spent 20 years reading exactly this kind of behavior for a living, and I knew, the way you know a set of books doesn't add up before you've even run the total, that whatever was in that box was the one thing in this entire estate my brother was actually afraid of. People don't make 6 phone calls about a box of sentimental clutter. They make 6 phone calls about the one document they're hoping never sees daylight. I flew back to my own city that night and did what I do professionally when something doesn't add up. I called a colleague, a paralegal I'd worked with for years named Priya, and asked her, off the clock, as a friend, what my actual legal standing was if my brother tried to have that box declared lost or destroyed before the year was out. She pulled the relevant probate statutes for our state that same evening, unpaid, over a glass of wine at her own kitchen table, because that's the kind of friend she is, and called me back within 2 hours. She told me plainly, in writing, in my mother's own will, I had a superior claim to that specific asset that no executor could simply override, and that if I formally notified the firm of my intent to claim it, in writing, within the year, Danny had no legal path around it at all, none, regardless of what he told himself or his wife. So I wrote the letter myself that night, 3 sentences, no more, stating my intent to claim the box under the terms of the will. I sent it registered mail the next morning, and I waited. I want to tell you honestly that the waiting was its own kind of hard. 20 years of not knowing what my mother actually thought of me had built a specific muscle in me, the ability to simply not ask the question and go on with my life. Waiting on that box meant asking the question again, actively, for the first time in 2 decades, and there were nights that week I lay awake running through every version of what could possibly be inside it that would make a grown man call a law office 6 times in 14 days. It took 9 days for the second thing to happen, the thing that told me exactly what kind of fight this actually was. Aunt Dot, who had stayed close with Russell's longtime office assistant Carol, since the 2 of them had gone to the same church for 30 years, called me on a Thursday evening sounding almost embarrassed to be the one telling me. Carol had, without meaning to eavesdrop, overheard part of a phone call Danny made from the office lobby while waiting on Russell, and had mentioned it to Dot mostly as idle concern, not realizing what it would mean to me. Danny had been talking to his wife, Sherilyn, and Carol had caught one full sentence clearly enough to repeat it word for word. Can we just say the box got misplaced in probate? I really don't want this getting complicated. She's a forensic accountant now, for God's sake. You know exactly how she's going to read into things. I sat with that sentence for a long time after Dot hung up. It wasn't rage exactly that I felt. It was something closer to confirmation. 20 years of being told, one way or another, that the truth was inconvenient, and here it was again, in my own brother's voice, wanting a locked box quietly disappeared before I could so much as look at it. I didn't call Danny. I didn't call Russell to confront him either. I filed the sentence the way I file every piece of evidence in my professional life, dated, sourced, and set aside for the moment it would actually matter. Then I called Russell's office myself and I asked, politely but firmly, that the release of the box, and any conversation about the estate that concerned it happened at a time and place of my choosing, since I was, after all, the only person legally entitled to open it. He agreed. I chose my own conference room, at my own firm, on a Thursday morning 3 weeks later. I told my husband, Tom, what day it was, and he cleared his calendar without my having to ask him twice. If you've ever had to be the one who stays calm while someone else's whole story starts to come apart, you already know what that morning felt like before I'll even tell you. I'll be right back with it, but first, if this is the kind of story that hits close to home for you, I really do want to hear about it in the comments, especially if there was ever an object in your family, a box, a letter, a piece of jewelry that ended up meaning more than anyone expected. Those details are the ones I remember most from the messages people send me, and I read every single one. Danny arrived at my office 14 minutes late, which for a man who used to show up early to everything just to make sure he got the good seat, told me something already. He came alone, no lawyer, which surprised me a little, and no Sherilyn either. Russell had driven the box over himself the day before, sealed, and it sat on the conference table between us. The entire meeting, small and cedar-colored, with a brass clasp gone slightly dull with age. Tom sat off to the side, not at the table, close enough to be present, saying nothing, which was exactly what I'd asked of him. Russell himself had asked, almost sheepishly, if he could stay for the release, purely as a formality, he said, though I think some part of him wanted to see it too after 11 years of carrying an unopened secret in his own office safe. I told him he was welcome to. He turned out to be, in his own quiet way, kind about it. The kind of small decency you don't expect from a lawyer whose only real job that morning was to witness a signature. At one point, while Danny was still standing and pacing near the window, Russell leaned over and told me, quietly, that whatever was in there, he'd sat with that box for 11 years without once being tempted to guess, and that he thought that took a particular kind of restraint from a woman who'd clearly decided a long time ago that some things weren't his to know either. It was a small moment, and it had nothing to do with the family drama at all, but it steadied me more than I expected. The receptionist had set out coffee that neither Danny nor I touched, and I remember noticing the clock on the wall behind him read 9047 when he finally sat down, which meant he'd spent almost a full 3 minutes standing before he could bring himself to take the chair across from me. Danny didn't sit down right away. He stood at the far end of the table with his hands in his pockets and said, before I'd even said good morning to him, that he thought this whole thing was a waste of both our time, that whatever was in there was almost certainly just some old junk of Mom's, sentimental clutter, not worth either of us making a production out of. He said he'd be happy to just have it sent to a storage unit, unopened, so we could both move on with our lives. I asked him, evenly, why a box full of sentimental clutter was worth 6 phone calls to Russell's office in 2 weeks. He didn't have an answer for that. 4 seconds of silence. Boy, I counted. He tried a second approach after that, the one I'd honestly expected from the start. He said that whatever the box turned out to hold, he was prepared to be generous, that he'd already talked to Sherilyn about it, and that if I wanted, he could set aside a portion of the estate for me privately, quietly, nothing that would need to go through Russell's paperwork at all, just to put the whole thing to rest between us. He named a figure, $22,000, said almost carelessly, like a number he'd landed on in the car on the drive over rather than one he'd thought through. I told him I hadn't asked for money, and I wasn't going to start now, and that the box wasn't a negotiation, it was mine to open by the terms our mother herself had written, whether he liked what was inside it or not. I took my key out of my coat pocket, the one my mother had mailed to Russell's office 11 years earlier without ever once mentioning its existence to me, and I opened the box myself, at my own table, in my own building. Danny didn't try to stop me. I think, by that point, some part of him had already understood that he couldn't. Inside, on top, were 20 birthday cards still in their envelopes, each one addressed to me in my mother's handwriting, at whatever address of mine she'd apparently kept quiet tabs on over 2 decades, and each one, every single one, unsent. 20 years, 20 cards, one for every birthday she'd missed on purpose. I laid them out across the conference table in a row, oldest to newest, the way I'd lay out a set of monthly statements for a client who needed to see a pattern rather than just hear about one. I read the postmark dates on the outside of a few of them out loud, plainly, the way I'd read a set of transaction dates to a client. Danny's face changed somewhere around the 4th one, and by the 11th, the one from the year Josephine was born, he'd stopped looking at the table at all and was looking instead at a spot on the wall somewhere above my head. Underneath the cards were photocopies of the 2 original loan documents from 20 years earlier, the forged $18,400 and the forged $28,450, both bearing my father's forged signature, both stamped, I noticed for the first time, with a small handwritten annotation in the corner in my mother's hand. The date she'd apparently quietly paid off the remaining balance herself, 11 years after the fact, out of her own account, without ever telling my father, without ever telling me, and without ever once correcting what she'd told that dinner table 20 years before. I read the dates off those annotations too, out loud, the same way I'd read anything else into a professional record. March of that 11th year. A final payment, in full, 4,100 and change, closing out the balance for good. Danny said quietly, almost to himself. I didn't know she'd paid any of it back. I told him that was, in fact, the whole point of the box. At the very bottom of the box was a single sheet of stationery, folded once, with 7 words written on it in a hand that had gotten shakier with age but was unmistakably still hers. I knew it was Daniel. I'm sorry. I read it out loud, once, the way I'd read a final line item to a room full of people waiting for a total. I didn't editorialize. I didn't need to. Danny's face had already gone the color of the cedar in front of him. He reached toward the note like he might pick it up, and then didn't, his hand stopping about 6 inches short, hovering there for a second before he pulled it back into his lap. I told him, once, evenly, the phrase our mother had used on me at that same kitchen table 20 years earlier, the one I'd carried around in my chest ever since like a stone I couldn't put down. A mother protects her son. That's what mothers do. I said it back to him exactly as she'd said it to me, no anger in my voice, just the plain fact of it laid on the table alongside everything else. Except, she protected you from the truth, I told him, for 20 years, and she protected herself from having to say it out loud to my face. That's not the same thing as protecting a person. That's just delay with better packaging. He was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that I actually looked at the clock on the wall behind him. 17 seconds. Then he said quietly, in a voice I hadn't heard from him since we were kids, back before either of us had learned to talk to each other the way the rest of the family talked. I didn't know she kept any of it. I thought if she'd just let it go, it would go away with her. I thought that's what happened to things like this. They just go away. That was the crack. One real, unscripted sentence, the fear underneath 20 years of certainty finally showing through, and for about 3 seconds he looked less like the man who'd stood at the head of a hardware store counter for 2 decades, and more like the 7-year-old who used to hide behind my mother's apron whenever he'd broken something he knew he'd have to answer for. And then, almost immediately, the way I suppose I should have expected by then, he straightened up in his chair and said, "But that doesn't change anything now. It's still my name on that store." I still built the business back up after Dad couldn't run it anymore, took out a second mortgage on my own house to keep the doors open the year the co-op down the highway nearly put us under. You weren't even there for any of that. You don't get to walk back in now and act like none of what I'd built since matters. I told him, quietly, that I wasn't disputing anything he'd built in the last 20 years, that the store was his, fairly, and I had never once come here to take it from him. What I was disputing was a single sentence, spoken at a dinner table 2 decades ago, that had cost me every relationship in that family for 20 years, so that his engagement to Sherilyn Pruitt could stay clean for a few more months. I told him our mother had spent 11 years quietly paying off a debt he created and 20 years never once telling the truth about who created it, and that the only thing I was asking of anyone in that family was that the story finally matched the facts. Not an apology performed for an audience. Not a check written to make the discomfort go away. Just the truth, spoken once, out loud, by the person who'd actually let it happen, to the person who'd actually paid for it. Danny didn't say the words. I want to be honest with you about that, because it would be easy and satisfying to tell you he broke down right there and gave me the whole confession in one clean piece. He didn't. He sat with it for a while, turning one of the birthday cards over in his hands without opening it, and then he said, after another long silence, that he needed time, that this was a lot to sit with all at once, that he'd call me. I told him I wasn't waiting on that call to move forward with my own life, that I'd already done that for 20 years, and I intended to keep doing it whether or not the phone ever rang. Then he picked up the empty box, which I let him take, because the contents were the only part I'd ever actually wanted, and he left without shaking my hand or looking at Tom, who hadn't said a single word the entire meeting and, I think, didn't need to. After the door closed behind him, Russell gathered his papers quietly and told me, before he left, that in 11 years of practicing estate law, he'd handled maybe 4 instructions as unusual as my mother's, and that this was the first one where he'd walked away actually believing the person who wrote them had spent the whole time hoping, in some buried way, that the truth would eventually get told, even if she couldn't bring herself to be the one standing in the room when it happened. Tom didn't say much either, just came and stood next to my chair and put his hand on my shoulder for a moment, the way he does when he knows there isn't a sentence that would actually help. I sat at that conference table by myself for another 20 minutes after they'd both gone, looking at 20 envelopes still fanned out across the surface, before I finally gathered them up and put them back where they belonged. I want to take you forward about 8 months from that morning because the part of this story people usually want most is the part where everyone hugs and everything is fixed, and I'd be lying to you if I gave you that. My father called me 11 weeks after that meeting, on a Sunday evening, the same time slot Aunt Dot had used to call me every week for 20 years, which I don't think was an accident. His voice was older than I remembered, thinner, with a small catch in it he didn't used to have. He said he'd heard from Dot most of what had happened in that conference room, and that he'd spent a lot of the last 2 months thinking about that dinner table 20 years ago, and about the fact that he'd sat there and said nothing while his wife told a room full of people that his daughter was a thief. He told me, in a voice that kept starting and stopping, that he'd known, even at the time, that the numbers his wife gave him about my supposed theft never quite made sense with the daughter who used to balance his register for fun on slow Saturday afternoons when she was 13, and that he'd told himself it wasn't his place to question her, because that's how their marriage had always worked, and that he'd spent 20 years since telling himself that same excuse until it finally stopped holding any weight at all. He said, I should have driven to that college graduation you sent me the announcement for, back before you stopped sending them. I should have said something that night at dinner, any single sentence, even just her name, wait, or that's not fair, and I didn't, and I've had 20 years now to sit with the fact that I didn't. He didn't ask me to forgive him, not directly, and I noticed that, and I think he meant for me to notice it. He asked instead if he could call again sometime, and I told him yes, but slowly, no visits yet, just talking, the way you'd rebuild anything that's been left to sit unused for 2 decades, a little at a time, testing the weight before you trust it with anything heavier. We've talked 8 times since then, always on Sunday evenings, and twice he's mentioned wanting to meet Josephine someday, and both times I've told him we'll see, which is, for now, the truest answer I have. Danny never called back. Aunt Dot told me, about 4 months after that meeting, that she'd heard through the same channels she always used, the same church group and the same careful network of people who'd kept me half informed about that family for 20 years, that he'd told a mutual acquaintance the whole thing was, in his words, ancient history that Mom should have just let die with her, and that he didn't see the point of dragging any of it back up now that she was gone and couldn't defend herself. That was the last time his name came up in any conversation I've had since. I don't expect it to change. Some doors, once they're that heavy, just stay closed, and I've made a kind of peace with that being the honest ending rather than the neat one. I still think about the 6 inches his hand stopped short of that note, and some part of me believes that's the closest he'll ever come to picking it up. These days, my life looks almost aggressively ordinary, which after everything, is exactly the point. Tom and I still have dinner at 6:30 most nights, the same time my mother used to serve dinner in a house I haven't set foot in for over 2 decades, though I only realized the overlap a few years ago and decided, after thinking about it, that I liked the hour too much to give it up just because she'd used it first. Josephine, who's 25 now and works in public health 2 states away, calls most Sundays at 7, the same hour Aunt Dot used to call me, which I don't think either of us noticed until I pointed it out to her one night, and she went quiet for a second and then laughed, because some patterns, it turns out, are worth keeping even after you understand where they came from. Aunt Dot, who's 74 now and still drives herself everywhere she wants to go, comes to stay with us for 2 weeks every August, and last summer she and Josephine put up a batch of peaches together in my kitchen, the same recipe Dot taught me 30 years ago, and I stood in the doorway watching the two of them argue cheerfully about how thick to slice the fruit, and thought, not for the first time, that whatever the word family actually means, it had been standing in my kitchen the whole time, I just hadn't always known to call it that early enough. The cedar box sits on a shelf in my office now, empty, the lock still intact, and I use it, oddly enough, to hold spare keys, which felt like the right, small, private joke to make with an object that had spent 20 years holding nothing but what somebody was too afraid to say. That's my story. 20 years, 20 unmailed cards, and 7 words on a piece of stationery that took my mother until she was already gone to finally write down. I think about those cards more than almost anything else in this whole account, the fact that she sat down and wrote them year after year and then couldn't bring herself to walk them to a mailbox. That, to me, is the real shape of cowardice, not the absence of feeling, the presence of it folded up neatly and never sent. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from it, it's this. The people who ask you to carry the blame for someone else's mistake are very rarely doing it because they believe you're guilty. They're doing it because it's easier than telling the truth out loud, while they still have the chance to live with the consequences of it. My mother knew the truth for 20 years, and only found the courage to write 7 words of it down after she no longer had to watch my face while I read them. I don't say that with bitterness anymore, most days. I say it because I think a lot of you watching this have your own version of a locked box somewhere. A person who knew something true about you and never once said it, while it could have cost them anything to say it. If this story meant something to you, I'd love it if you'd hit like, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments about a moment in your own life where the truth finally caught up with the story someone had been telling about you. I read every one of them, and more often than you'd think, they're the reason the next one of these gets written. Thank you for sitting with this one all the way through, and I'll see you in the next one.